So we jump forward some 12 years to get to Sweatt v. Painter. And this is again the NAACP sort of attacking this idea of a separate but equal doctrine head on and looking at it in terms of higher education. Now, there's a reason why Missouri XRL Gaines and Sweatt v. Painter are chosen. Think of the environment of the nation in the late 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. It's not as though segregation was solely a regional thing. It was quite broad. And to demonstrate to judges that separate but equal laws were inherently problematic, the NAACP decided that the best way to actually do that was to attack separate but equal laws in a forum, in a venue in which judges absolutely understood. And so they go after law schools, because judges should be easily able to identify how separate but equal laws or separate but equal rules don't actually provide equal legal education, because they know what a deficient legal education could do. And so the NAACP very particularly targeted law schools. Sweatt v. Painter is another case involving a law school, and also targeted medical schools. And because these two, they thought, were very easy for judges, individuals who were very learned, to understand that the separate but equal nature simply was unworkable in these environments, that separate could never be equal. And this is a case, Sweatt v. Painter, in which separate was absolutely not equal. And it was very easy to demonstrate this to the Supreme Court. So Texas did not admit African Americans to the University of Texas Law School, but it had created a separate one for African Americans. That seems to be what the previous precedent, Missouri v. XRL Gaines, had actually argued for. And it seemed to be the Supreme Court in 1938 was okay with that. But in this case, the challenge is that the separate, whether a separate law school can ever be equal, and if not, is that a violation of the Equal Protection Clause? And in this case, the NAACP demonstrates in a very convincing fashion how the nature of the separate law school set up in Texas for African Americans could never be equal. So the way by which they do this is they demonstrate that the African American law school was unequal in a number of ways. Of the ways that are listed, number of faculty, the variety of courses and the opportunity for specializing in an area of law, the size of the student body, the scope of the library, the ability to engage in law review or other sort of legal activities, think of moot court, mock trial, these sorts of things, that while they were absolutely separate, they were in no way, shape, or form equal. That the African American law school was deficient in all of these characteristics. There were much less faculty. The variety of courses were exceedingly limited, and students couldn't really specialize in any given area. The size of the student body was abysmally small. The library was a joke. And any sort of law review and other activities were, if they existed at all, were not on the caliber of UT's law school in any way, shape, or form. And we should be able to understand this. If you were to get a degree from UT Law, even today, that degree has attached to it a pedigree. Individuals who practice law know what a degree from UT Law means. That pedigree didn't exist for the African American law school, and it absolutely would never exist And the Supreme Court makes it very clear that as applied, this separate but equal system it can never be equal in terms of legal education. And so this separate but equal in terms of legal education is pretty much done away with in this case. The Supreme Court says qualities which are incapable of object measurement, but which make for the greatness of the law school. Such qualities named but to a few: the reputation of the faculty, the experience of the administration, the position and influence of alumni, the standing in the community, the traditions and prestige that all surround a legal education will never be equal between UT's law school and the established African American law school. And so these qualitative, intangible factors were the reason why the Supreme Court basically ends segregated legal education in the United States in this case. And so we see that from 12 years from Missouri to Sweatt v. Painter, there's a chip in the armor of separate but equal. It might be a very tiny chip, but it's an important one, because separate but equal laws in terms of legal education are now unconstitutional. They're a violation of the 14th Amendment, because the separate nature of the education can never be equal. And that's an important step that the court takes. And in the same year, it takes an even broader step. Questions? So all of these cases were done by the NAACP? Yeah, this was a concentrated legal strategy. Yes, Madeline, that's exactly right. They provide, like, they were like, okay, let's get an understanding of what separate but equal in terms of Plessy means. Does it mean this? Does it mean that if Missouri doesn't have a law school, they can send individuals to one in another state? No? Okay, so we know what separate and equal means. It means the state has to provide. And so in this case, in Sweatt v. Painter, the state does provide. University of Texas provides an African-American law school. And so in this case, the NAACP goes, okay, so you've provided us with separate. There is a separate legal education, but is it equal? In no measured imagination could it be equal. And that was something that was very, very easy to demonstrate to lawyers, to judges, because they understood. I mean, how many of the judges on the court in 1950, if you'd asked them, the first thing they said was that they would have gone to Harvard or Columbia or Yale and Stanford. That's part of their identity. And the reason why it's part of their identity is because it has an amount of prestige to it. And that prestige could never be gotten at any of these other law schools that were created solely for African Americans. So it was very easy to demonstrate the quantitative differences. So like number of faculty, variation in courses, law review, like those quantitative differences, things that can be easily be measured, was really easy to demonstrate. But it was really the court kind of took a bite out of the qualitative factors, the things that are much more difficult to measure and identify, like prestige. Prestige is this kind of loose term, but we all know what prestige is. It's just difficult to measure. And it seems that the judges on the Supreme Court at the time kind of went, yeah, this is never actually going to be able to work, at least in terms of law school, because the prestige is important in terms of law school, as are all of these other qualitative factors, like alumni. Like, how many folks do you know who got a job on somewhere because they went to the same law school as someone else? So they got the in because they're both alumni of the same law school. Like, that happens all the time. But the ability to do that is very different depending on what law school you go to. And that's what the court's pointing out here. It wasn't just prestige. Like, they went through and were like, hey, let's look at the library at the African American Law School, the law library at the African American Law School versus UT Austin. What are the differences? Well, I think if I remember correctly, the African American Law School had a copy of the Supreme Court Reporter, and that was it. Like they didn't have copies of any of the state reporters, any of the appellate court reports. There just wasn't. It wasn't a comparable library, and it was very easy to demonstrate that. I think the law library also didn't have any subscriptions to periodicals, so like they weren't getting other universities' law reviews. So that's like one of the parts of legal education is you're reading other law reviews, and it just, so these quantitative differences were absolutely there. But the NAACP wanted to make the intangible argument too, because they're absolutely going to come back to it. Not in this case, but in future cases. So getting the court to buy into this idea that intangibles are important, that it's not just quantitative differences, but it's these intangible differences. That was the important part. So they didn't just argue that it was prestige or these other intangible things. They also had a boatload of quantitative factors, but they wanted to make sure they got both. Because if they could hinge on this idea of intangible factors like prestige are important, then when they get to Brown, they can argue a lot more intangible factors. So it was all strategy, and very good strategy. And I don't think it's clear. I don't think I've mentioned it yet. But one of the clear legal architects of this for the NAACP goes on to be a Supreme Court justice. Like this is where Thurgood Marshall cuts his teeth, is on these cases. So his strategy, and not just his strategy, but the larger NAACP strategy, was recognized in the legal community, even if conservative lawyers at the time really hated the changes that were taking place in the law. It was very clear that they respected how the NAACP was doing it.